please join me in welcoming Russell Sadler to the Portland City Club again.
Thank you, Don. That's the most recent introduction I've had. It's true I graduated from the University of Oregon. I graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree. We abbreviate that a BS degree. If you don't know what that means, you will in about 20 minutes. Election night caused great euphoria among Republicans. Ronald Reagan told reporters he couldn't remember the last time he was this happy. After the election, both parties held strategy sessions, the Republicans in Williamsburg, Virginia, the Democrats at Disney World in Orlando. That's fitting. The Republicans want to return to the 18th century. The Democrats are still in Fantasyland. When Newt Gingrich addressed the Republican governors, he called for a new world order: military supremacy, no welfare, cultural rebirth. It was a stirring speech, but it sounded better in the original German. Jesse Helms says Bill Clinton is unfit to be commander-in-chief. Helms wants someone with first strike capability, someone willing to strike the First Amendment. Helms is one of those senators who wants to get God back in the schools. If he could get North Carolina to pay them more than $13,000 a year, he might get some teachers there, too. Helms is upset with the Smithsonian for displaying the airplane that bombed Hiroshima, the Enola Gay. He thinks it's another one of those homosexual art exhibits. And there's trouble ahead for the Endangered Species Act. Bob Packwood has just announced the list of endangered species will become the Senate dining room menu. And finally, from California comes the news that Michael Huffington trails Dianne Feinstein by 156,000 votes, with 35,000 left to count. Huffington says he's just happy he hasn't been mathematically eliminated yet. Huffington was educated in Texas. And then there was Cher. On learning that her ex-husband, Sonny Bono, won a seat in Congress, she said, "Politicians are just one step below used car salesmen. I have no belief in the system, so Sonny's perfectly at home there. Politicians don't work for the people. The system works for the politicians. It's a huge crime to be so greedy and let the people down and the country fall apart." From Rush Limbaugh to National Public Radio, the national media are in a frenzy about the Republican takeover of Congress. It is a sea change, a tidal wave, a tsunami. There is less here than meets the eye. The Republican takeover of Congress just changes the letterhead on the permanent government that controls Washington. And if recent history is any guide, the faces will change, the rhetoric will change a lot, but not much else that really matters. You see, conservatives still don't get it. Voter frustration is not partisan. Voters are not unhappy with Democrats and cheery about Republicans. They are increasingly frustrated with the agenda of the permanent government of lawyers, lobbyists, and foundations that occupy Washington and ignore their interests. The Republicans were swept in by the fifth twist of a revolving door that has been spinning since voters dumped bumbling Jerry Ford for the conservative Jimmy Carter in 1976. Carter's conservative agenda of deregulating banks, savings and loan, and airlines was not what the voters were looking for. In 1980, the second twist of this revolving door dumped Jimmy Carter, who told us government couldn't solve all of our problems, for Ronald Reagan, who said government was our problem. A Republican majority in the U.S. Senate slipped in the revolving door on Ronald Reagan's coattails. Reagan's rhetoric was soothing while he tripled the national debt. The Senate's performance was unconvincing. And the third twist of the revolving door expelled the Republican majority in the Senate and handed control back to the Democrats. The fourth twist of the revolving door dumped George Bush, Ronald Reagan's heir apparent, who insisted government was the problem, for Bill Clinton, who said government could solve our problems. The fifth twist of the revolving door, expressing building voter frustration with politicians who failed to deliver on their promises, handed Bill Clinton his head and invited Darth Dole and Grinch Gingrich to show what they could do. Please note, there is no partisan pattern to these entrances and exits. Neither Dole nor Gingrich seem to realize they too are caught in a revolving door that can throw them out at any time. The Republicans appear to have learned little from their experience in the revolving door in 1981-86. No sooner did voters give them control of Congress than Republican leaders began singing the litany of the permanent government in Washington. Tax cuts, bigger defense spending, selling government land and assets to private investors, trade agreements that compromise American sovereignty. All this conducted by the Heritage Foundation choirmasters. This self-described think tank is a tax-exempt public relations mill that hires intellectually pliable pseudo-academics to give their corporate campaign contributors' political prejudices a patina of academic legitimacy. It is the ringmaster of the permanent government in Washington. The renegade Ross Perot threatened this cozy arrangement in 1990 by giving a voice to the growing frustration outside the Beltway. But Bill Clinton won the presidency, and the issues Perot raised were promptly stifled by the ideological thought police inside the Beltway. Most of the Washington press corps was again singing along with the Heritage Foundation and the wannabes, Bill Safire, George Will, Thomas Sowell, Malcolm Forbes, Cal Thomas, Rush Limbaugh, and the other spinmeisters shilling for the permanent government. A political science professor at the University of Oregon anticipated this voter frustration driving this revolving door as early as 1976. Those of you who are veterans will remember this man. He spoke to this club on more than one occasion. Dr. Gerald Kiefer was assistant to Arthur Fleming when Fleming was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in the Eisenhower administration. Fleming became president of the University of Oregon in 1961, and Jerry came out with him. Dr. Kiefer taught a course in federal public administration. And in class one day, Kiefer got into a debate with a belligerently conservative student who'd read a bit too much Bill Buckley, and who felt the federal deficit, this is 1967, remember, the federal deficit would bankrupt the country within a decade. The deficit, said Kiefer, is not a serious problem as long as it remains small and we owe it to ourselves. But if the deficit grows, the payments on the interest become a larger and larger portion of the federal budget. There is a limit to what people are willing to pay in taxes. And eventually, the fixed cost of government and interest on the national debt will soak up all the money that people are willing to pay. Then, said Kiefer with uncommon prescience, there will not be enough discretionary revenue to solve people's problems. That could lead to a series of one-term presidents and a revolving door in Congress as voters become frustrated with elected officials who cannot do anything about their problems. Today, the federal government is broke. It is unwilling to do anything about the problems of ordinary people who pay the bills. Jerry Kiefer's revolving door at the White House and on Capitol Hill has been spinning since 1976. Interest payments on the national debt are the second largest item in the federal budget, right behind military spending. The Federal Reserve sees inflation in every economic statistic and raises interest rates, stifling the U.S. economy to protect the principle of the foreign nations that loaned us their money during the Reagan reign of borrow and spend, when the national debt tripled, making us the largest debtor nation in the world. The U.S. Treasury borrows nearly $1 billion every Friday to make interest payments on money we have already spent, while Congress pompously postures about cutting taxes, cutting social programs for the poor, and coyly avoiding discussion of tax exemptions that create so many discount passengers on Oregon's and American's ship of state. In the 1980s, the Republicans blamed Reagan's failure to balance the budget on the Democrats. Now the Republicans control both houses of Congress. They will be held accountable for their inability to govern. In this election, the Republicans ran out of scapegoats, and there are no more excuses. Mark Hatfield and Bob Packwood have been here before. Hatfield chaired the powerful Appropriations Committee that spends the money. Packwood chaired the powerful Finance Committee that raises the money, both in the early years of the Reagan administration. It didn't last long. Voters became disenchanted with the way Republicans used their majority power and returned control of the Senate to the Democrats 6 years later. Voters have given Republicans another chance, but there is no sign Republicans have learned anything from the 80s. This flashy contract with America promises tax cuts similar to the popular tax cuts of the Reagan era that tripled the national debt. Newt Gingrich and his conservative choristers are singing about a new beginning. The more you listen, the more it sounds like the same old song and dance. Newt's first order of business was appointing a Republican to take charge of Capitol parking places. These guys know what's important in Washington. Then Gingrich announced the House would pass a constitutional amendment by July 4th permitting Protestant prayer in public schools. This choice of priorities is remarkably similar to Bill Clinton's decision to make his first battle with Congress over homosexuals in the military. Both are losing causes far from the important priorities that preoccupy most voters. At Representative Bill Archer's first news conference, this Texas backbencher, who will chair the Tax Writing Ways and Means Committee, announced that his first job is tax reduction for the oil and gas industry. Then he announced he will repeal the federal income tax and install, you guessed it, a value-added tax. That little number cost Congressman Al Ullman his job in 1980. Now, this is not a new beginning, people. This is politics as usual, paying off campaign contributors and supporters at the expense of the voting public. Hatfield and Packwood are among the cooler heads. That was heads, not hands. They will preside over the two elements necessary to balance the budget, or at least reduce the federal operating deficit. There are not enough votes in Congress to make the politically painful spending cuts needed to balance the budget with present revenue. Reducing the deficit without more money requires deep cuts in popular programs that the young and the working poor finance for the middle and upper class, like Social Security, military and federal pensions, and Medicare. Any realistic plan to reduce the deficit or balance the budget will require spending reductions and more revenue. Now, raising taxes or repealing existing exemptions, shifting the tax burden back to business and the other discount passengers created in the 1980s is definitely not on the permanent agenda of the permanent government in Washington. Controlling the deficit is much more important to people outside the Beltway than tax cuts. Perot's 1990 campaign popularity proved that. The permanent government doesn't care about the deficit as long as it remains tax-free. The Republican takeover of the Oregon legislature is also less than meets the eye. For decades, the Oregon legislature has been divided between its urban and rural factions, not its Republicans and Democrats. The most enduring legislation of the last quarter century, the land use laws, the environmental protection laws, the bottle bill et al., were not passed on partisan votes. They were passed by a closely divided legislature that worked out what they regarded as the pluses and the minuses in the annealing crucible of close votes. Relatively few bills in the Oregon legislature pass on party line votes. Oregon's legislative Republicans have lost their strongest leaders. House Speaker Larry Campbell was far more concerned with exercising his personal power than in nurturing talent in his party. This Republican leadership vacuum is made to order for Governor-elect John Kitzhaber's considerable persuasive talents. Just as former Governor Vic Atia's detailed knowledge of state budgets and penchant for micromanaging actually made him the right leader in the right place in the recession-ridden 80s, John Kitzhaber's consensus-building skills should make him the right leader in the right place in the 90s. The legislature's Republicans have created a shaky coalition between their suburban members, their Portland suburban members, and East Side and downstate Republicans. The new Speaker of the House, Representative Bed Clarno, is nominally from Bend. That's a nice gesture to the women's vote that so overwhelmingly went to John Kitzhaber in the governor's race. Senate President Gordon Smith is from Pendleton, where he must live up to the reputation of a long line of distinguished legislative leaders from Umatilla County, like Senator Mike Thorne and Representative Stafford Hensel. But Smith and Clarno hold their offices by the grace of Portland suburban Republicans like Jeanette Hamby and Senator Tom Hartung. Portland suburban voters are still as green as City of Portland voters. If the downstate and east side Republicans try to roll back the state's landmark environment and land use laws too far, they risk the offices of the suburban Republicans who give their party their present majority. Remember, the fundamental division in the Oregon legislature historically is not between Republicans and Democrats. It is between urban and rural members. That split is now contained almost entirely within the confines of the Republican Party. And how well they temper their appetites and manage their differences will determine how long the Republican majority lasts. Oregon continues to elect Democrats to statewide office while it elects Republican majorities to the legislature. The problem here is demographic, not schizophrenic. You see, Oregon was a one-party Republican state with an agrarian economy prior to World War II. That war marked the industrialization of the Pacific Northwest. Wartime industries attracted skilled blue-collar labor in large numbers for the first time. And many stayed after the war to become the backbone of Oregon's industrial labor force and the core of a growing Democratic majority. Today, most of the region's industrial manufacturing jobs have been shipped offshore. The timber industry is now milling 30-year-old trees instead of 300-year-old trees. There is less wealth in the wood and less money to pay mill workers. A large number of blue-collar workers just don't live in Oregon anymore. And those who remain are spread out over the state trying to make a living. They no longer live in concentrations that allow them to elect a majority of Democratic legislators. Outmigrating blue-collar mill workers have been replaced by upper-middle-class managers and professionals fleeing the mess they've made in California and in other states. The 1993 in-migration study conducted by the Oregon State Department of Employment shows over half the people moving to Oregon that year identified themselves as professionals or managers. And the managerial class tends to elect Republicans, not Democrats. Yet Democrats still make up a majority of Oregon's voters on a statewide basis. 49% of Oregon's registered voters are Democrats, about 38% are Republicans, and the rest of us won't identify with either. Given an attractive Democratic candidate or an extreme Republican candidate, these Democrats elect Democrats to statewide office. That's how Oregonians can elect a Democratic governor at the same time they hand control of the legislature to Republicans. This demographic diaspora of Democrats does more to explain the apparent Republican triumph more than the partisan claptrap served up by the pundits shilling for the ideological thought police on the Potomac. There was another largely unreported casualty of the November election. It is a concept called public journalism, and it is writhing on the counting room floor. I know, you all thought that all journalism was public journalism, didn't you? I've been at this for 30 years, and I thought the same thing. I mean, I write for the public. No, we are wrong. Public journalism is a trendy gospel that preaches editors must return newspapers to their readers and avoid process stories beloved of elites and political insiders. The goal of public journalism is reconnecting citizens with their newspapers by celebrating heroes and ordinary people doing everyday things. Some newspapers are turning their editorial pages over to their readers in an effort to reconnect them to the political process. The editor is to play the role of the community organizer and show leadership by participating in news events and acting on their convictions. According to the acolytes of public journalism, professional detachment is out, activism is in. Dispassion is out, participation is in. Adhere to this formula, say the high priests of public journalism, and the readers will return. They will joyfully go to the polls, more informed and eager as ever. Sandra Rowe, the new editor of the Oregonian and one of the archbishops of public journalism, has been quoted in a recent journalism review as saying, "I would rather raise voter turnout 10% than win the Pulitzer Prize." That beautiful theory was mugged by a brutal gang of facts on Election Day. Despite dozens of public journalism experiments in newspapers from coast to coast, voter participation was 38% nationally and 57% in Oregon, the lowest voter turnout in this state since 1978. The conspicuous failure of readers' agendas and the pretty graphic displays with the dumbed-down summaries of complicated issues written by public life teams was not the result of their novelty. The concept, in my opinion, of public journalism is based on a mistaken premise. You see, citizens are not staying away from the polls in droves because elites have taken over their newspapers or because they feel disconnected from the political process. Citizens are fed up with more than media horse race polling, soundbite journalism, and television attack ads. They are not apathetic. The voters who are staying away from the polls in droves are making a considered decision against voting. Many are no longer willing to lend their name or their numbers to legitimize a process they feel no longer represents them or operates in their interests. I am telling you, voting at the polls is losing its legitimacy. The decisions we make at the polls are losing their legitimacy. Government is process by definition. The late Wayne Morse used to tell us, endlessly I can tell you, Morse used to say, "Show me who controls the process and I will tell you the results right now." Americans know voters are no longer in charge of the political process in Washington. They know it is firmly in the hands of the permanent government of lobbyists, lawyers, and foundations that occupy the national capital. And indeed, they are not happy about it. The solution to this disillusionment is certainly not more of the same old media coverage, I agree. But it is also not allowing the techniques of modern marketing that corrupted the political process to corrupt the time-tested news-gathering process. Polls have done to the political process what the rating system did to television. Readership surveys and other political market research threaten to do to newspapers what polling has done to the political process. Market research employs the tools of the second guess. It is a conceit of the marketing industry, with apologies to those in attendance who are members. It is a conceit of the marketing industry that it is possible to divine what people really want, in politics as well as products. Polls suggest a majority opinion. Some people assume that must be true and adopt the opinion, which is then reflected in the next poll. Like a kitten chasing its tail, no one is sure where real public opinion begins and ends. Was the opinion authentic or manufactured by the poll and the publicity that followed? Polls are a snapshot of a transient moment of opinion in the past. Polls look firmly backward. Market research measures consumer behavior here and now without the benefit of any information that will certainly change people's minds in the future. Why do you think polling varies? Polling in a state with substantial in-migration like Oregon creates yet another distortion. It samples the opinions of people so new to the state, they do not yet have the knowledge to form considered opinions about this place yet. So we get the opinion of the place they just left. Firmly armed with this magic marketing knowledge, Oregon editors casually bulldoze or ignore local political traditions insufficiently recorded by market research. This is the history of Orange County. It is now the core of the cultural conflict in Oregon. It is the growing culture of the second guess, in which editors allow dated market research and employee group gropes to replace fallible but vital human intuition and seasoned judgment and experience. The 200-year-old American experiment in self-government is reporting process. That's what it's about. The alternative to reporting process is reporting personalities and conflict. In a word, sensation. Public journalism is not new. People in television who endured the consultants 15 years ago recognize this rhetoric about reporter involvement, the public short attention span, the condescending dumbing down for Joe and Jane Sixpack. Well, the newspapers are just catching up. Those in television also know that is the rhetoric that started us down the slippery slope of infotainment and infomercials. And we know where that goes. At the bottom of the slippery slope is hard copy, current affair, Oprah, Geraldo, and God spare us, Gordon Elliott. It leads to TV reporters who don't know the difference between Edward R. Murrow and Murray Povich. Are the newspapers following the television people down this slippery slope to slobbery? You're going to have to make your own guess. I must tell you, however, I begin to worry when $45,000 a year yuppies from the explaining classes call the Tonya Hardings of this world white trash and then justify class prejudice as a human interest story. The public journalism movement is unilaterally changing the terms of the unspoken contract between the editors, the reporters, and the readers. Because market research says you will read the result. People, that's not democracy, that's paternalism. That is not participation, it is manipulation. This trendy one-size-fits-all public journalism is forcing an homogeneous national culture down the throats of local newspaper readers. Now, it may make newcomers comfortable. It certainly eases the life of mobile managers who are rarely in place long enough these days to learn the territory. But it is offending the intelligence of more thoughtful readers who would rather have their news the old-fashioned way, unvarnished by individuals and not committees, so that they can make up their own minds. This is no less a serious matter. Public relations, marketing research in politics and journalism is clouding our vision of ourselves. It is forcing on us national culture and national ideology at the expense of place. And it is not dealing with the crucial conflict in this state between people who have lived here a long time and who have a sense of community, that is, government is an extension of ourselves, and the new people moving in who have no sense of community because they've never lived in one, and who feel government, therefore, is their enemy. Oregon's future hangs in the balance. It could be the same future the World War II generation created by financing the roads, the parks, the public works, and the educational institution on which our present prosperity rests. Or it could be a future in which people who have made theirs continue to drive down the wages of those who do the work to lower the cost of living for the well-to-do. This is the plantation mentality that treats employees as a cost liability instead of an asset. This is the plantation mentality that treats education as a burden instead of an investment. This is the Bourbon mentality of a corrupt and decaying oligarchy that dismisses the brain drain and worries only about their own wallets. This is the plantation mentality that gripped the South after the Civil War and kept it in economic penury for 100 years. Today, Oregon is firmly in the grip of the plantation mentality. Wealthy candidates and their campaign contributors tell us we must live within our means, while they systematically reduce the means of the public sector despite relentless population growth. That is a prescription for a declining standard of living, people, a declining civic standard of living. Denny Smith got his money the old-fashioned way. He inherited it. Lake Oswego Representative Bob Tiernan, who spearheaded the effort to welsh on public employee contracts, got his money the medieval way. He married it. And if you don't think there aren't other wealthy oligarchs telling you how to think, look at the names of the corporate nabobs who contributed to the measures welshing on public employee contracts and driving down private construction workers' wages. Now, you don't have those names. But if you want them, I suggest you ask any public employee you know. They've got them all. While these plantation overseers posture about working people who make too much money and sloganeer about no new taxes, by which they mean no shifting of the tax burden onto their campaign contributors or themselves, the rest of this state is rapidly losing its standard of living. Don't kid yourself. Even in Portland, it is happening. At a time of 3 to 5% population growth, the money that Oregonians invest in themselves, bricks and mortar, not bureaucrats, public works money I'm talking about, has declined by more than 40% since 1979. We are not building to meet this growth. We are running up against capacity built in the 60s and 70s. While the prison population has grown to more than 6,600, there are now 6,000 fewer Oregon students in Oregon's public four-year colleges and universities. Last year, 2/3 of Oregon's high school students who averaged B+ or better went out of state for their higher education. Oregon is now exporting its children. These are early signs of a state in decline. Now, the conservative Republicans have postured over adequately financing government for the 2 decades they were out of power. It is the Republicans in the legislature who helped fail to come to grips with the school financing problem created by 1990's ballot measure 5, the property tax limitation. It was Republicans who slyly converted a tax balance issue into a debate over the size of government to avoid making the hard decisions on how to finance a growing state and ignoring the growing signs of civic decay and decline. Today, the Republicans control both houses of the legislature, and with it the purse strings and the policy. John Kitzhaber can lead this elephant to water, but he can't make it wade. The Republicans have avoided the responsibilities of governing for decades while they were in the minority. There are some of us who doubt they have the capacity at all to govern. They would rather sit on the perimeter and lob grenades. But the voters have chosen to give the Republicans the responsibilities of governing, and they can avoid those responsibilities no more. Election day, they ran out of scapegoats, and they ran out of excuses. Well, when I was at the university, I had a speech professor who said at gatherings like this, it was my job to talk and your job to listen. I noticed that only 2 or 3 of you have finished ahead of me. So we'll give these services the benediction, and thank you very much.
Now it's our chance to put Mr. Sadler to the test here with some additional opinions. Please come to the microphone, identify yourself by name and as a member of the club, and keep your questions, if you would, brief. We'll start with the first question from Pete Heuser.
Mr. Sadler, one of the things you touched upon is something that really disturbed me in this last campaign, and that is the negative campaigning and the advertisements in particular. We saw it in the first campaign and the Bund campaign as well as many others. Do you think those advertisements were successful? Do you see that as something that's the wave of the future? And is there something we can do about it to stop this trend if in fact it is one?
The most obvious answer is yes, they're successful, but in fact there has been research done by University of Oregon journalism professor Jim Lemmert on a nationwide basis that shows this negative advertising actually in the long run backfires against most candidates. And we saw more people doing negative advertising lose than win this time. There's no question that this is having a wearing effect. It's a dynamic. It is probably one of the principal reasons that fewer people go to the polls. There is only one solution to this. You cannot regulate it. We're dealing with free speech here. The only way to deal with this problem is not to reward the people who use it. If you vote for them, they will continue to use it. If you want to make this a one issue for you, that's probably a good idea. But the trick here is if they think it's successful, they will continue to use it. If you don't vote for them, it will stop.
Is Nancy Stanley with us? She's scheduled to give the next question, then we'll take yours, sir. Nancy?
Maybe we have the third question. I'm Nancy Stanley, member of the City Club and co-chair of the Education and Human Development Committee. Mr. Sadler, welcome, and thank you for being here. My question is that in that public education has become a political issue in this state, do you see a process available to us that would return the responsibility of education to the educators and the availability of education to all of the state citizens equally?
Well, of course, there's no way that publicly financed education will restore the authority of education to educators. This money comes from parents, and we have to be accountable for it in some fashion. One of our demographic problems is there are fewer parents with children in school these days than there were in the post-World War II years. And so those people and their desires have less of a role in our larger political system. I think the issue is not whether we are going to return it to educators, but whether we are going to take control away from Salem and restore it to local school boards. That is far more important. Measure 5, conservatives, by God, this was it, this was our savior, and what it has done, of course, is centralize government in Salem, where they can bash it better. Okay? I don't know what has happened to the conservative feeling that the government closest to the people governs best, and all, you know the litany, right? Okay? They are not practicing it when they have the opportunities. Somewhere along the line, we have to restore authority for curriculum and hiring and firing, not to central bureaucracies in Salem, where both the union and the political activists can beat it around, but return it to the 200 and some now local school boards, where it is closer to the parents who have children in school, and they can get together with the teachers, the professional educators, and decide what's best for their children in that place. That has been the time-honored way we have financed public education. I don't see any other acceptable way to do it, and that is the challenge of the next legislature.
Yes, sir.
Dave Olson, member. I almost think we ought to have you back here again to talk about ballot measures. But I'd like to know your opinion on what do you think about revising the Constitution with a ballot measure?
Oh, am I glad you asked that question. This has to stop. It may be acceptable to elect a governor by 825 votes. It may be acceptable to elect other elected officials. But to change the entire blueprint of the state, the governing document, whether it's the Bill of Rights or whether it's a system where people in Portland vote overwhelmingly for a measure that in effect strips autonomy from the geographic majority of the state. That's what 1990's ballot measure 5 did. It stripped the autonomy of all the cities and counties that didn't vote for it. And they were the majority of them geographically, because the numbers live in Portland. This is not acceptable. It is not acceptable to change the basic blueprint when only 57% of the voters turn out. You cannot welsh on public employee labor contracts by 825 votes out of 57% of the registered voters and expect it to be an accepted decision. Brother Tiernan is writing, it's the will of the voters, it's the will. It's not the will of the voters. It happens to be the will of the voters who met at that time and that place. And it isn't enough, people. Now, yes, I have a prescription, and I appreciate your question. I've been selling this, and I'll tell you, the man we have to convince is Secretary of State Phil Keisling. Let me tell you what I want, what I think will do it, and it's not just this is not original, I've seen this done elsewhere, and what Secretary Keisling's concerns are. First, there needs to be a geographic requirement for signature collection. Okay, right now they stand outside of suburban shopping malls in this community, this whole suburban metropolitan area, and buy signatures, and that puts anything on the ballot. No, 20% of the required sum must come from each of the 5 congressional districts. I want them to go to Fossil and Ontario. The next question is passage. Mere majority does not protect the geographic majority of this state. Now, we will have to live with the people of Portland choosing governors of Portland. That's the way the world works. but not changing the Constitution and the individual autonomy that we have to arrange our own financial affairs in our own communities, which is what Measure 5 did. We need to have a constitutional amendment pass in a majority of 3, 4, or all 5 congressional districts. Pick it. How high do you want to make the hurdle? That's a policy decision. Now, Secretary Kiesling says, no, Russell, all I'm going to do is raise signature requirements. Well, that means they'll just go for more money and buy more signatures. That's no solution. And Phil and I have talked about this. He knows my views. We have to have a geographic passage. He is worried about supermajorities, and he's not wrong to worry about supermajorities. Supermajorities are now paralyzing California. You need a 2/3 vote in California to pass any financial measure. Now that means 1/3 plus 1 can sandbag anything. That's rule by minority. So it's a problem. I don't propose it for ordinary business. I am proposing these higher hurdles for constitutional amendments that change the agreed upon consensus under which we all live. It is a problem. The Oregonian had one of its useful polls this time said 55% of the people polled said we should have a right to vote for anything that got on the ballot. And 43% said there were too many issues on the ballot. What they didn't tell you was that that same poll with that same question taken 10 and 15 years ago showed 60 and 70 people in favor of voting on anything they get enough signatures for. The support for our revered system of initiative and referendum is eroding, and its results, the decisions we make, are increasingly considered not legitimate, and that is very serious in a democracy.
Next question.
Ted Kay, City Club member. I guess it's my turn at the fire hose. I did want to ask you your opinion of some of the ballot measures. You've talked about your opinion of the process of getting them into place and their passage. Would you care to share some comments on the results, what's there more or less to meet the eye in the ballot measures this time around?
All right, well, like everybody else, I do care about what happens to the ballot measures to some degree, but I by far more am concerned with the process by which they pass. How much knowledge do people have of these very complex issues? There are a lot of people today who are stunned by the passage of Measure 16, this physician-assisted suicide bill. This measure, in my opinion, is the epitome of the way the initiative and referendum ought to work. The suffering is noble crowd still underestimates the people's feeling about dying as a machine-tended vegetable, pumped up until family assets, insurance, and government benefits are drained, and then they will pull the plug. Now, the medical people take offense at that, and I'm just reflecting a reality that's out there. It's not my opinion. I've got too many doctors in my background to believe that. But there are people who believe it. The people are out ahead of their elected officials on this one. And yet that initiative has problems. It's got problems of liabilities for pharmacists in it. It is not a perfect bill. But it will not go to court. I do not believe the court will enjoin that. And you know why? Because it was a statute, an initiative statute, not a constitutional amendment, and the legislature can deal with the problems. There will be people who will try to gut it, and they will be subject to recall as soon as the legislative session is over if they do anything so damn stupid. But they do get another whack at it to see if they can't take what the voters decided and make something of it so that it isn't unworkable. Contrast that with ballot measure 8, which will be in the courts ad nauseum. Now, the problem with this is not whether we can welsh on public employee contracts or not. And understand the 6% pay-in is peanuts. That's not the issue. The issue is that there are people who have been retired or working for 20 years, storing away their sick leave, understanding it would become part of their retirement. And now you say they can't. A woman of my acquaintance is a teacher in her 29th year. She's not eligible for retirement till next year. She has 220 days stored up. That's worth $60,000. And by 825 votes, she's just had it taken from her. If that's acceptable, then the sanctity of contracts in the Constitution is meaningless. A whole group of people called public employees have been constitutionally prohibited from collectively bargaining for retirement benefits, while all private employers or employees have that right if they should organize to exercise it. That's not equal protection of the law. This is going to be here a long time. The question is, what happens to the money? They're going to start taking it away from public employees in January. If any of this is overturned, we have to refund that money. Now, the courts have already told the legislature to refund over $150 million that they have improperly taken from the State Accident Insurance Fund and from certain private retirees. These no new taxes folks have gotten no plan other than to take it out of the hide of present services to pay back for their mistakes of the past. Measure 8 is costing every one of you millions of dollars in interest while we hammer out Bill Sizemore and Bob Tiernan's little personal vendettas in the courts. You will bear that bill for anything that is found unconstitutional. That's why it was so close. Most people understand that. We cannot amend our Constitution this way. The results are not acceptable to too many people. Mr. Polani? I know, Mr. Polani.
Thank you.
Needs no
Thank you, Mr.
introduction.
Sadler. Well, I think you probably know what I'm going to ask, or something similar.
Trains are one of my favorite subjects, too, Ray.
The people, the voters of this region, in the climate of Measure 5, decided to saddle themselves with bonds for $475 million for the South-North Light Rail, the local share of the South-North Light Rail. Does this make sense, or shouldn't it instead be transportation money, even though that means people revisiting a constitutional restriction?
Ray, let me turn my rant about Portland and governing the state and turn it around. You will never get votes in other parts of the state to convert any part of the gas tax money to mass transit, because with the exception of specialized applications in the rural parts of this state, it is not viewed as a practical alternative. I think the people of Portland are far-sighted, you may call it saddling, it's a great word, in accepting this obligation, okay, because I think light rail is the only alternative to this continued enlargement of highways and driving people out. The votes are not there in the rest of the state. It is unacceptable in the rest of the state, and the reason for that is the feeling is Portland gets the lion's share of the gas tax money anyway. That's a half-truth, but they believe it. And if they were allowed to convert the light rail, they'd take the light rail money out of the rural highway business and still give you your freeways. So I think what was put on the ballot was the only practical thing, and I think the voters of the metropolitan area acted wisely.
Ray, let me see if we have any other questions before you
Well,
follow up, okay?
I would like to have a rejoinder, though.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Mr. Sadler?
Over here.
There's one.
You may as well let the people on radio and television into this. It's all right.
Randy Smith, member also. What impact do you see of Measures 6 and 9 on the political process?
Measure 6 is probably completely, is it 6? That keeps you outside your limits, outside your district. That's probably unconstitutional on its face. It'll take us a while to do that. And by the way, people, that goes into effect December 8th, unless it's enjoined. And violation of it, that is contributing or receiving, contributing, you writing a check, okay, or receiving, is a felony. To give money to someone outside your district, okay? Don't do it yet. We also passed a ballot measure that strips anyone convicted of a felony from their legislative seat. So the price for this is high. Measure 9 will probably do some good. If you will look at Measure 8, you will see what public employees have been concerned about. If you will look at the contribution and expenditure report, there was an amazing amount of pass-through money from people who donated to Bob Tiernan and people who thought they were donating to Measure 5 that Bill Sizemore shoveled over to Measure 8. The Republican Leadership Fund, which is the money the state senators use to keep their offices, $84,000 of it was shoveled over to the ballot Measure 8 campaign. There are a number of Republican senators in areas with large amounts of public employees who are dancing at this moment, frantically trying to explain how that happened. That's called pass-through, and that kind of shenanigan is relatively limited by Measure 9. Money talks. Every student I teach, follow the money. Harry Bodine taught me that when he was on the Capitol beat at the Oregonian. Follow the money. And he wasn't talking about Woodward and Bernstein. They came later. He was talking about the Ways and Means Committee. He was talking about the campaign contributions and the appropriation bills. It's still follow the money. You can put up all the barriers you want, but people who are determined to have their way will spend it. It is far more important that it is public at some point and we know who gave what and where it went than whether we limit people's ability to give it. Far more important to know who gave it and where it went. It tells you a lot about motives.
I have time for one last quick question.
Stuart Gates, member of the City Club. Could you give us your observation as a participant in the public press to the fact that in the car of the fellow who shot up the White House with a machine gun was found a Rush Limbaugh article. Now, would you, as a as an observer of public taste in politics, political writing, would you give us your observation on that, please?
Well, I agree Rush Limbaugh is tasteless, but I don't think he's causal. I knew I was getting old when I made a speech to a Rotary Club in Medford, and a gentleman, 30-something, came up to me, and he said, "Who is this Tom McCall you keep talking about?" I have had some difficulty the last decade explaining to people what Tom used to call the Oregon story, or that Oregon prior to the Oregon Citizens Alliance, prior to the California Carpetbaggers, prior, okay? A date in which we viewed government as an extension of ourselves, doing our will, doing for us the things we could not do individually, and so forth. And for years I have been grappling to find a way to just hand somebody a cultural history of Oregon that says, try this. Well, we can do that as of this week. The Oregon Historical Society has just published a book called Fire at Eden's Gate by Brent Walth, a young man who has been working for he worked for Willamette Week, then he worked for the Register Guard, and he has just left the Register Guard to join the Washington, D.C. Bureau of the Oregonian, one of their more intelligent hiring decisions. I rather suspect Brent won't come back. He doesn't know I'm saying this. This is my guess. My guess is they're going to snarf him up at the Post or the Times. I think he's that good. And if you read this book, I think you will too. This is the first arm's length biography of McCall since his own autobiography. Brent is 30-something, barely 30-something, and so he has the skepticism of people who never knew the man. At the same time, he took the time to spend a great deal of time in the McCall papers, in the archives, and at the Historical Society, and therefore this young man has an institutional memory that rivals those of us who lived through the period. And I think you will find those two things an absolutely devastating combination. He is also a great writer. This book I'm using as a textbook in a course of Oregon politics because it's a life and times biography, and it has a great deal of social, cultural, and political history in it, as well as McCall. This is what you do when somebody comes up and says, "Who's this Tom McCall you keep talking about? What's this Oregon story?" It's for all your California neighbors, okay? I want to thank you. Speaking to this club on any occasion is an honor. more than once is a distinction. But we were talking up here, and I believe this is the 9th or 10th time in 30 years that I have been invited to speak to you. And aside from the annual command performances that you demand of elected officials, that's a lot. I want you to know that my mother and my father, who are Mr. Josephson's guests today, have been at every one of them. And I'm very grateful to you for the privilege. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Russell. I think we now understand, and we appreciate it. We're adjourned. Great.
Yes, ma'am.